Imagine a city so powerful that its inhabitants believed they were invincible. Colossal walls, incalculable riches, and an army feared throughout the region. Nineveh was the beating heart of the Assyrian Empire, a symbol of arrogance and pride. But beneath the grandeur of this metropolis, dark secrets were hidden. Rampant corruption, palace betrayals, and human sacrifices that stained its streets with blood. The impenetrable city seemed untouchable, until one man dared to defy its fate. Nahum, an often forgotten prophet, emerged as the voice of divine justice. He carried no weapons or commanded armies, but his words were like sharp blades, cutting through Nineveh's illusions of safety. His prophecies were not just warnings, they were sentences. He announced divine judgment with relentless clarity, describing the total destruction of the city and God's punishment for an empire that found itself above heavenly law. But as with so many messengers of truth, Nahum was ignored, ridiculed, and even persecuted. After all, who would dare believe that the great Assyrian capital could fall? The signs began to emerge, first discreet, then undeniable. Disturbing dreams tormented the king. Scribes found ancient records that spoke of a terrible fate, and a mysterious plague began to spread. Even so, Nineveh's pride prevented her from seeing the obvious. Her end was near. The city that ruled with an iron fist, that crushed its enemies without mercy, was now about to face a force that not even its gigantic walls could stop. This account is not just a story of the past, but a timeless warning. The fate of Nineveh was not written just to be remembered. It was recorded to teach. What happens when the arrogance of an empire challenges divine designs? How can betrayal and internal corruption be more lethal than any foreign army? And above all, what can we learn from Nahum's prophecy for today? Prepare to delve into the never-before-told narrative of the destruction of Nineveh. Discover the hidden secrets of this city, the shocking details of its fall, and the stunning accuracy of Nahum's prophecy. Follow every moment of tension, betrayal, and ruin in this terrifying true story about the fate of an empire that dared to defy God. Nineveh was not just a city, it was an empire in miniature, a monster of stone and blood that stood as a symbol of absolute power. Its walls were colossal, almost 30 meters high, and so wide that carriages could run over them. Fortifications were considered indestructible, protecting a civilization that saw itself as unbeatable. But behind its grandeur lurked a growing darkness. The people indulged in pride, trusting more in their military strength and riches than in divine justice. The city's golden glow masked what few dared to recognize. Nineveh was rotting from within. Corruption flowed through its streets like an invisible river. The rulers indulged in excessive luxury, while the people suffered under oppressive taxes and laws made to benefit the elite. Trade was vast, bringing tribute and treasure from distant lands, but along with wealth came dark practices. Human sacrifices were common, macabre rituals performed to ensure the protection of the gods. The priests and scribes knew the truth, but those who talked too much mysteriously disappeared. The city remained powerful, but at a price that, sooner or later, would need to be paid. Even the grandest empires have invisible cracks, and Nineveh was no exception. The arrogance of their leaders blinded them to signs of decadence. The king of Nineveh saw himself as a demigod, untouchable and absolute. No foreign army dared challenge him, as anyone who tried was mercilessly crushed. But while the city laughed at the possibility of its fall, on the other side of the walls something was brewing. A trial was underway, silent and relentless. Those who studied the scriptures knew something was wrong. The scribes and priests, guardians of knowledge, began to notice sinister patterns in history. Every empire that grew excessively ended up collapsing. Every king that declared himself invincible ended up forgotten. But who would dare question the fate of Nineveh? For ordinary citizens, the city was eternal. For those most attentive, time was running out. And then, the first cracks began to appear. Small, seemingly unimportant signals began to spread. Stories were told of omens, of dark dreams, and of whispers in the shadows. Something was coming, something that no wall could stop. But still, Nineveh remained blind to what was approaching. Among the great prophets of biblical history, Nahum is a name often ignored. He didn't get the same recognition as Isaiah or Jeremiah, but his message was just as powerful as theirs. He emerged as a messenger of divine justice, a herald of Nineveh's imminent end. His book did not carry warnings of repentance, as Jonas did decades earlier. This time, the sentence was definitive: the impenetrable city would fall. But who in Nineveh would listen to a man who spoke of misfortune when the city was in its prime? Nahum's words echoed like thunder through the streets. He spoke with the conviction of someone who had already seen destruction happen. He prophesied that Nineveh would be swept away by an overwhelming force, its walls would collapse, and its king would fall into disgrace. But instead of arousing fear, his predictions were met with mockery. The priests and scribes, who knew the danger of defying him, laughed quietly as they conspired to silence him. For the city's leaders, Nahum was nothing more than a fanatic seeking attention. After all, what force in the world could destroy Nineveh? The prophet, however, did not need swords or armies to make the most attentive hearts tremble. His prophecy was a warning not only to Nineveh, but to any empire that believed itself to be above the consequences of its actions. He described in detail divine judgment. The waters of the Tigris River would turn against the city, a foreign invasion would come like a hungry swarm, and Nineveh's arrogance would be its undoing. But Nahum also knew that the city's pride would prevent any change. Nineveh had no regrets. She clung even tighter to her power. Nahum's preaching was not only ignored, but ridiculed. Elites laughed and organized lavish banquets while guards joked about inevitable destruction. However, far from the palace parties, rumors began to emerge. Strange dreams plagued the king, ancient priests looked to the heavens with concern, and a scribe found forbidden records that spoke of a similar, centuries-old forgotten prophecy. Time was running out, but Nineveh still refused to listen. And then, the first signs began to appear. Small events, easy to dismiss as coincidence, began to become more and more frequent. Something was happening, something that Nahum already knew, but that few were ready to see. Great empires never fall overnight. Before ruin, there are always signs. In the case of Nineveh, the omens began to appear in a subtle way, almost imperceptible to those who did not want to see. Unseasonable storms battered the city. The winds howled as if carrying warning messages. The waters of the Tigris River began to rise unusually, threatening to overflow. Some said it was just nature taking its course, but for those paying more attention, it was clear something was about to happen. The king's dreams began to disturb him. In the silence of his chambers, he woke up panting, tormented by visions he did not understand. Images of fire-consuming temples, statues of the gods falling to pieces, and a faceless army marching against Nineveh. Priests were called upon to interpret these omens, but their responses were vague and calculated. No one dared tell the king that destruction was written. No one wanted to be the bearer of such a terrible truth. It wasn't just the king who noticed the changes. Scribes began reporting strange events in royal records. Some spoke of wild animals entering the city and prowling the temples as if they were running away from something. Others mentioned that, in broad daylight, darkness took over the sky without explanation. The city, which once boasted of its grandeur, began to feel the weight of fear. But even so, the denial was stronger. Nineveh's pride was a greater barrier than any wall. In the midst of all this, Nahum's words began to resonate differently. What was once considered madness now seemed like a frighteningly accurate prophecy. He had described the destruction of Nineveh as an inevitable event, where neither its armies nor its gods could save it. And now, the signs were everywhere. But the city preferred to cling to the illusion of its invulnerability. After all, who could overthrow the most powerful city in the world? However, what Nineveh did not know was that the real blow was yet to come. Something much bigger than her fears and dark dreams was approaching. The fate was already sealed, and the signs were just a prelude to the judgment that was about to fall upon the city. In the heart of Nineveh, among the immense halls of the palace and the sumptuous temples, secrets were hidden that few dared to mention aloud. Behind the glory and wealth, the city carried a dark weight, fueled by macabre rituals and silent conspiracies. Malik, an ambitious young scribe, discovered these mysteries when he came across forbidden records, written on parchments long locked in the royal archives. What he found there was more than history. It was a silent confession of an empire built on blood and sacrifice. The documents spoke of ancient pacts, sealed with rituals in which human lives were offered to guarantee the city's protection. Kings and priests, fearing losing the favor of the gods, performed secret ceremonies underground in the main temple. Children and prisoners were sacrificed, and their screams were drowned out by the chants of the priests. Malik felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that such practices were not a thing of the past. They still happened, hidden under the luxury of the Assyrian capital. His mentor, Harit, a veteran scribe who had worked at the palace for years, warned him not to go any further. "Some truths cost more than we are willing to pay," he whispered to her one night. But Malik could not ignore what he had read. If the gods of Nineveh demanded so much blood, what kind of justice really governed the city? He began to realize that corruption and sin were rooted in every layer of the empire. The king, the priests, the generals, all were involved in a dangerous game to maintain power. The scribe began to put the pieces of the puzzle together and realized something even more frightening. Nahum's prophecy was not just a metaphor. Ancient records mentioned a cycle of destruction that always returned when a city strayed from justice. Malik understood that Nineveh had crossed the threshold. It was no longer a question of if the city would fall, but when. And he knew he couldn't keep this truth alone. However, knowledge can be a death sentence. And in Nineveh, those who knew too much did not live long. Malik didn't realize that in seeking the truth, he had become a target. The city did not forgive traitors. And now, he was being watched. In the center of the Assyrian Empire, sitting on a golden throne, the king of Nineveh refused to believe the rumors circulating around the city. For him, it was all just gossip spread by fanatics and cowards. The city walls remained standing, the armies remained strong, and the royal coffers overflowed with riches plundered from neighboring nations. He believed that his position was unshakable and that the gods were still on his side. But fear was beginning to infiltrate the halls of the palace, whispering in the ears of those who were not blinded by arrogance. The priests tried to reassure him with even more bloody rituals and sacrifices. The king ordered that offerings be doubled, that more prisoners be delivered to the altars, and that the temples be decorated with gold in honor of the gods. However, nothing seemed enough. The dark omens grew, the floods became more frequent, and the people began to murmur about the glory days coming to an end. But instead of seeking answers, the king chose the easiest path: ignore. To maintain order, he increased repression. Anyone who spoke of destruction or questioned his authority was summarily executed. Nahum's words were forbidden, and any scribe who dared to record them suffered the wrath of the crown. The king saw the prophecy as a personal affront, an insult to his reign. "No insignificant prophet will dictate the fate of the most powerful city on earth," he said, while organizing new festivals to demonstrate that everything was under control. But deep down, the weight of premonitions began to eat away at his mind. During the nights, his dreams became inescapable nightmares. He saw the palace in flames, the bodies of his soldiers scattered across the streets, and a growing shadow covering Nineveh. He would wake up bathed in sweat, but would soon dismiss these fears as fleeting illusions. "The city will never fall," he repeated to himself like a mantra, trying to stifle the doubt that was beginning to grow within him. However, the walls that protected Nineveh could not contain what was coming. While the king tried to cling to power with trembling hands, destruction was already moving towards him. Outside the city gates, foreign armies were organizing themselves. Inside the walls, betrayals were planned in the shadows. The king's denial would not change his fate. Nineveh's time was running out, and the ruler who thought he was untouchable would soon discover that no one is above divine justice. The truth is a dangerous burden, and Malik soon found that out the hard way. After finding the forbidden records and realizing that Nahum's prophecy was about to be fulfilled, he became a marked man. He was not just a curious scribe. Now he was a threat to established power. The palace could not allow someone with this knowledge to remain alive. The shadows of the city, which had once only whispered conspiracies, now moved to silence him. His mentor, Harit, tried to warn him, "There are eyes everywhere. If they know what you discovered, your life no longer belongs to you." But it was already too late. In the middle of the night, palace guards broke into Malik's house. They searched his parchments, destroyed his notes, and dragged him through the streets of Nineveh like a traitor. Harit, who had tried to protect him, suffered the same fate. Both were taken for interrogations that rarely ended well. The city that had once been his home now turned its back on him. Through the dark alleys, Malik saw familiar faces looking away, afraid of being associated with him. Some murmured words of pity, but no one dared to intercede. Nineveh was ruled by fear as much as steel, and defying the king meant signing one's own death warrant. Yet, in the midst of betrayal and persecution, there were those who saw the truth. Not everyone believed that Nineveh was invincible. The corridors of power were in turmoil. Inside the palace, generals and priests began to divide. Some still clung to the illusion that everything was under control, while others were already plotting in silence. The smartest saw that the empire was cracking, and faced with the certainty that the city was not as impenetrable as it seemed, hidden alliances began to emerge. If Malak had sensed Nineveh's inevitable fall, he was not alone. Trapped in a damp cell, injured and not knowing if he would see the light of day again, Malak still didn't know that the city's fate was already sealed. While he awaited his trial, forces much greater than himself were already in motion. Outside the walls, armies gathered. Inside, factions were forming. Betrayal was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. And when an empire begins to crumble from within, total ruin is only a matter of time. The day has finally arrived. The sky over Nineveh darkened as if the sky itself refused to bear witness to the city's fate. Nahum's prophecy was about to be fulfilled, and nothing could stop divine judgment. First came the plague. Mysterious illnesses spread through the poorest neighborhoods and soon reached the palace corridors. Doctors tried to contain the calamity, but their herbs and rituals had no effect. The gods, who once seemed to protect Nineveh, were now silent. Then came the storms. Torrential rains lashed the city for days, and the Tigris River, which had always been an ally, became an enemy. The waters rose without warning, flooding parts of the wall and weakening its foundations. It was as if the earth itself was conspiring against Nineveh. What once seemed impossible was now before the terrified eyes of the population. The city walls began to give way. An empire that thought itself eternal was about to be swallowed by chaos. But the final blow came not from nature, but from human hands. While the rulers were still trying to understand what was happening, a foreign army appeared at the city's gates. Nineveh's enemies, long awaiting its fall, saw the perfect opportunity. The Babylonians and the Medes joined together to attack, and now, with the walls weakened, Nineveh was no longer impenetrable. Soldiers invaded the streets, burned the temples, and looted the palaces. The terror that the city once imposed on other nations now fell upon it. The once proud and arrogant king found himself surrounded by destruction. His allies disappeared, the gods he worshipped gave him no answers, and his fortress was crumbling around him. Divine judgment had arrived, and nothing could stop it. The same people who once shouted his name were now running through the streets trying to escape the massacre. Malak, once a persecuted scribe, saw it all happen from the shadows, knowing it was inevitable. The prophecy was fulfilled before their eyes. The city he believed to be eternal was reduced to ashes. The roar of flames and cries of despair echoed among the ruins, and in the midst of them, Nahum's words still hung in the air. Nineveh defied divine justice and paid the price. His end was not just a tragedy, but a reminder to all who dared to follow the same path. The king of Nineveh, who once saw himself as a god among men, was now nothing more than a fugitive in his own city. When he realized that his walls could not resist, he abandoned the throne and tried to escape through the palace's underground passages. His pride, which had once made him believe in the immortality of his empire, was now a burden too heavy to bear. The streets were on fire, the temples were destroyed, and enemy soldiers were already walking on the rubble of what had once been the heart of the Assyrian world. But arrogance always takes its toll. As he tried to escape, he was betrayed by his own men. His generals, seeing that the battle was lost, decided that their best chance of survival was to hand over their king in exchange for mercy. He, who was so proud of his absolute power, was now alone. Captured and humiliated, he was taken before the leaders of the enemy army. There was no more gold to bribe them, no more armies to protect it. His sentence was written from the moment he chose to ignore the signs. Nineveh's enemies were not merciful. They remembered the massacres carried out by the Assyrians, the cruelty with which they subjugated other nations. The king, who had previously rejoiced in seeing his enemies on their knees, was now forced to taste his own medicine. His execution was brutal, serving as an example for any other ruler who believed he was above fate. Nineveh's pride died along with him, buried under the rubble of the city he swore would never fall. Meanwhile, the last survivors tried to escape, but the city was a maze of ruins and ashes. Those who had once mocked Nahum's prophecy now realized their error, but it was too late. Divine judgment did not distinguish between kings and servants, rich and poor. All those who participated in Nineveh's corruption and arrogance were paying the price. There was no more refuge, there was no more hope. Just the memory of what was once a powerful empire, now reduced to dust. The fate of the arrogant always follows the same cycle. Rulers who think they are invincible fall. Empires that defy justice end in ruins. The story of Nineveh was not an isolated event, but a reminder to all peoples and nations. Pride precedes destruction, and those who ignore the signs of the fall are always the first to perish. What remained of Nineveh after its destruction? Ashes, dust, and silence. The city that once pulsed with life, where kings charted the destinies of nations, was now nothing more than an open-air cemetery. The streets were covered in debris, the palaces were turned into rubble, and the temples, once filled with gold and offerings, were looted and forgotten. The winds carried the smell of death, mixed with the memory of a past that would never return. The few who survived the invasion fled to distant lands, spreading stories of the impenetrable city's demise. These were reports that were hard to believe. How had such a powerful empire been so utterly destroyed? But for those who witnessed the fall, there was no doubt. Nahum's prophecy had been fulfilled with frightening precision. What once seemed impossible was now an undeniable fact. Nineveh would never be the same again. The ruins became a symbol of warning. Where once there was grandeur, now there was a grim reminder of what happens to those who defy divine justice. For centuries, travelers walked past the rubble and wondered how something so magnificent could disappear so quickly. Even archaeologists, centuries later, would find it difficult to reconstruct its history. Nineveh did not just fall, it was erased from the memory of men, as if it had never existed. And so, the city that once laughed at the prophets became a living example of the truth it tried to ignore. The kingdoms that came after learned to fear the fate that Nineveh suffered. But, as always happens, over time the lessons were forgotten. New empires arose, new arrogances rose, and history repeated itself more times than anyone would like to admit. The ruin of Nineveh was a warning. But how many actually heard it? The stones of Nineveh still sleep beneath the earth, silent witnesses to an empire he thought was above all. And for those who believe that its fall was just ancient history, a simple reminder remains. Empires fall, the arrogant are overthrown, and the fate of Nineveh may be the fate of anyone who dares to defy the justice that rules all things. The story of Nineveh is not just an account of the past, but a mirror that reflects the fate of any civilization that indulges in corruption, arrogance, and injustice. How many empires have emerged believing they were eternal, only to collapse in the same way? How many rulers have judged themselves above good and evil, only to end up like the king of Nineveh, betrayed, defeated, and forgotten? The cycle of fall repeats itself, because men insist on ignoring the lessons of the past. Nahum was not just a prophet of destruction, he was a messenger of inevitable truth. His prophecy was not a warning for Nineveh to change, but a sentence of something that had already been decided. The city's pride blinded her, causing her to ignore the signs until it was too late. But are we different? How many times do people, organizations, and even nations receive warnings that they are heading towards ruin, but choose to turn a blind eye? The fall of Nineveh shows that there is no power, wealth, or army capable of saving those who defy divine justice. Arrogance precedes a fall, and corruption always takes its toll. This story isn't just about an ancient empire, it's about all of us. It's about how we choose to live, about the consequences of our actions, and about the importance of recognizing the signs before it's too late. And now the question remains, if you had been living in Nineveh at that time, would you have believed Nahum's prophecy? Or would he have scoffed, as so many did? The truth is that this choice does not just belong to the past. Every day we have the opportunity to see the signs or ignore them. And in the end, everyone reaps what they sow. If this story made you reflect, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow more content like this. There are many other hidden narratives in biblical history that have yet to be revealed, and you won't want to miss them.